When Kirk Cousins joined the Atlanta Falcons, he might have let something loose that'll get them in trouble, and it could work out to the Vikings' favor. Let's figure out what could happen here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, where we're always trying to learn something new. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day, each and every day. I appreciate y'all so very much. Those of you who come here every single day and come hang out, try to learn some new stuff. If you are new here, hello and welcome. Hope you enjoy. My name is Luke. You can find the show wherever you find your favorite podcasts, whether it is the Sirius XM app or anywhere else where you listen to podcasts. You can also find the show on YouTube or Amazon Fire and Roku. Just download the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. And right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Today on the show, I'm actually going to spend most of the show talking about defensive line stuff. I baited you. We're going to actually do something more substantive than this weird story, but I figure now I have to talk about it because Tom Pelissero corroborated the report. I think Mike Florio was the first one on this, reporting that the Vikings were surprised to hear that Kirk Cousins sort of let the cat out of the bag in his introductory press conference with the Falcons. I promise you, we're not going to obsess over Kirk Cousins all the time, but this might actually impact the team. So in part of that press conference, he mentioned that he was very excited and, said all the right things about the Atlanta Falcons. And as part of that, he says, I loved, getting to know the people and, calling them yesterday and meeting with them yesterday and blah, 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 which by the timeline that he was not allowed to meet them in the yesterday he was talking about. He said that on Wednesday, and before 1 p.m. or whatever the deadline was, or whatever the league year turning over was, players and teams are not allowed to talk directly. In the tampering window, what the tampering window is your teams are allowed to talk to agents. And unless that player represents himself, you're not really allowed to talk to the player or establish that contact. So Kirk Cousins saying that he had established that contact makes it like a pretty brazen violation of the rules. So there's a couple questions. One, how much do we care? Two, what's going to happen here? And I think with the first one, I've already talked about tampering a lot because it was very clear that there was tampering going on at the combine, because there always is. And my stance on that remains unchanged. We do not care. And you don't want to pull at that thread. I would bet you dollars to donuts that the Vikings contacted, say, Jonathan Grenard before they were supposed to. I don't think they hammered that deal out in an hour. I would bet that they contacted Blake Cashman before they were supposed to, or Andrew Van Ginkel before they were supposed to. I would bet anything. And you know what? All the other teams do it too. I kind of think that it's just like this open secret and everybody still just sort of pretends it's against the rules. And I don't really understand the point of that. Just decide that you allow it. So I don't really care. So in terms of what to expect to come out of this, if anything, I'm a little bit less familiar with that, and it's really difficult to predict for a bunch of reasons that get into like the bylaws of the NFL, but it's information that you should probably know. Here's the deal. Short version is I wouldn't expect the Vikings to like get draft picks. I know some people are joking about how, they're going to have to do a pick swap, and we'll talk about why people are saying that in a sec, but I wouldn't get your hopes up for that. So other tampering cases have been met with wildly different punishments. The Dolphins got docked a first-round pick for tampering with Sean Payton and Tom Brady. The Eagles and Cardinals actually settled outside of the parameters of the NFL, which you're allowed to do if you want, to swap fourth or third round picks after they found out that the Cardinals had contacted Jonathan Gannon before they were supposed to hire him as the head coach. It was actually before the Super Bowl, and you're not supposed to do that. They the Cardinals self-reported, which it actually is stated in the bylaws that a self-report can is going to be considered as like possibly a lessening of a punishment. But the Eagles and Cardinals essentially came to an agreement and said we're both satisfied with this, which the league will respect. So that's that situation, and that's like a way totally different thing to go like from here to there, from the bottom of the third round to the top of the third round is way different than outright losing your first pick. And other tampering cases have kind of fallen in between. So what happens with this? There's an interesting thing in the bylaws. If you just Google like what the NFL's tampering policy is and you find like the NFL communication website's version of it, the PDF that they have linked, that's what I'm referring to here, which is the anti-tampering policy from 2018 to 2019. If this has since changed, I apologize, but I don't think that this particular part of it has in the new CBA. So part of this is that the offended club, which is the Vikings, could be awarded some kind of compensation if they were the ones that made a complaint. If the Vikings went to the NFL and said, hey, these jerkwads, they tampered and we lost our quarterback over it. What gives? Can you do something about it? And the NFL would consider that complaint. And if they decide that it's legit, then they go forward and then they can actually come to a determination, which is literally just Roger Goodell's opinion. Anything can happen. And again, this is the part I don't know if that changed, because I know that like it used to be the way that they would do like player conduct policy punishments would be Roger Goodell just like makes a judgment call. And they've since taken that out of his hands and are using more like third party arbitrators for that. I don't know if it's the same thing anymore in the current CBA. Super nerds out there, you know who you are. Go ahead and correct me on it if you feel like it. But point being, it's going to be someone's opinion on the matter. There is not like it's not like the US law where, well, if you do this, you can get, this sentence to that sentence. It's just kind of whatever somebody's feeling on the day. But I think that is also a crucial thing to consider, because when asked in his press conference about this, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell did a press conference to introduce like the new free agents, and they were asked about the Atlanta tampering thing, and Kwesi was like, we haven't been contacted at all about it. That's above me, that kind of thing, which is sure, like great, you're not going to make a big stink out of it. But the information we get out of that is that they didn't file the complaint. Otherwise, he would have answered that question differently. So the Vikings probably not in line to be considered the like quote unquote offended club in this particular matter. But they seem kind of upset about it, which again, very funny, because like, do we really want to start shining a black light in this motel room? That's the way I put it before. It's the way I'm going to put it again. And honestly, with regard to Kirk Cousins' situation, really all that changed was the timeline. Because according to all of the reporting that we've had for a year and has now been corroborated afterwards, and that Kirk Cousins even said on the podium in Atlanta that, it was going to be kind of a year-to-year thing in Minnesota. That was the way that he put it. It was trending toward being a year-to-year thing, I think were his exact words. And in Atlanta, they signed him to a 4-year contract. The first 2 are fully guaranteed, and the third one has some guarantees in it as well and looks pretty difficult to cut. That is a commitment that the Vikings were not going to match. They had, according to Ben Gessling, and I think Diana Rossini also corroborated this, they were going to partially guarantee year 2 and fully guarantee year 1. So the Falcons put in a whole extra year. And whether you had that conversation at the combine or if you had that conversation, right when the tampering window opened up when you were supposed to, and whether he had a Zoom call with the athletic trainer in Atlanta, when he was supposed to at noon on Wednesday or not, he was going to Atlanta. The Vikings were going to decline to match that. This was not a case where I think the tampering ended up mattering. Now, does that mean the rules shouldn't be followed and all that, blah, blah, blah? Yeah, sure. And maybe the Falcons get docked a draft pick here, but I don't think the Vikings have made a big enough stink to get themselves a draft pick. And honestly, they got bigger things to worry about, like their defensive line, which still isn't good enough. Let's talk about what they did there and the other things that happened in free agency on Thursday. Today's episode of Locked On Vikings is brought to you by Robinhood. Did you know that if you have a 401k for retirement, you can also still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar that you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024 validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood or IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC member SIPC is a registered broker-dealer. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day, each and every day. When you're done here, go check out Locked On Minnesota Sports, where we do the Minnesota football party on Mondays and Thursdays. We're starting to do those live, and boy, it went okay. For what that means, go to Locked On Minnesota Sports. You can find the YouTube page, or you can find, of course, the Minnesota football party right here on this audio feed if you're an audio listener. So, the Vikings made a couple more signings on Thursday. They are certainly not done, and I still don't think that they're done, but we got two more new friends to talk about. The first one was Jerry Tillery, a defensive tackle from most recently the Las Vegas Raiders. He spent most of his career so far with the Chargers. He was a first-round pick for the Chargers back in 2019. I believe he went the pick after Garrett Bradbury, or maybe the pick before Garrett Bradbury, and he didn't work out. That's maybe too harsh. So anybody who follows the draft super close is going to have this like super bad taste in their mouth when it comes to Jerry Tillery, because he was very highly touted defensive tackle guy. If you think about like Kalijah Cansey last year, that kind of guy, mostly a pass rushing defensive tackle, less so a run defense guy, and maybe most comfortable as a sub package guy, as a third down pass rusher on the interior, somebody that replaces, Harrison Phillips on 3rd and 10 when there's no threat of the run. Maybe that is the role that is best for him. He makes a deal worth up to $3.75 million. That up to is pretty important. We'll see how much of that is in, sack incentives or playtime incentives or something like that. But that is still, I think, enough money to imply that they have a significant role planned for him. Is that an every single down starter? Probably not, but it's probably Dean Lowry-ish. And the Vikings, to me, they cut Dean Lowry and replaced him with a player who I think about as highly of as I thought of Dean Lowry, and I did not think very highly of Dean Lowry. That said, I don't know him that well. All right, this guy just joined the team that I cover. And I do not cover the Chargers or the Raiders, so I have not gotten to know him as well as I would have to really be able to, in my opinion, to be able to be like, this dude totally sucks, and say that with confidence. And I think, to be honest, too many people say that with confidence. I challenge 97% of the people that are like, man, Jerry Tillery really sucks. Y'all watching Raiders tape to watch Jerry Tillery? Is that what we're doing? That's what I'm going to do. But for instant reaction, I don't know. I feel like people are not so much expressing an opinion on a player so much as doing what they're told. I don't know. If that's not you, if you actually are that into AFC West defensive tackles, then you go ahead and rub it in my face. And I'll catch up with you soon, because I do plan to watch him more closely and try my best. This is what we do on patreon.com/LukeBrownNFL, by the way. Try to throw the priors out the door. This is a hypothesis, not a conclusion. Isn't that guy kind of bad? That's what I've heard. That's where I'm at right now. But I don't want I want to give it a little more of a chance than just like going off of the reputation that I've heard, mostly through osmosis of other people who cover a team that I don't cover. So that's not really my opinion, right? That's just what I've heard of other people's opinions. And I think I can do better for you. So that's the promise I will make to you. Probably next week we'll talk a little bit about Jerry Tillery, and I'll actually get a chance to, when I actually get a chance to sit down and watch him. But there is a long line of guys on the defensive line that we have to talk about, from Grenard, who I still want to do like a dedicated episode to him, but the Vikings won't stop doing stuff. and same thing with Van Ginkel, with Tillery himself, Blake Cashman, Aaron Jones, etc. All of these players, I do want to stop and get to know. But the Vikings keep adding dudes to the list. Probably won't get a full episode dedicated to Trent Sherfield, wide receiver most recently in Buffalo, that has been around the block a little bit as very much a like depth piece wide receiver. I don't know if this dude's I don't think this dude's wide receiver 3 necessarily. Maybe he competes for that job, but he's mostly kept his way in the NFL on the back of special teams. At least last year, he played on both kickoff teams, both coverage and return, and on the punt return team as a jammer. There is a lot of experience there. He's been in the league since 2018, and this is very much a guy that goes into that kind of Brandon Powell bucket we had last year. Not saying that, we're expecting the same thing we got out of Brandon Powell, who I think exceeded the expectation we had, but we're applying the same expectation, which is this guy's probably fighting for his roster spot every year he's in the NFL. And actually last year I had Brandon Powell on the show to talk about that dynamic and what it's like to, be kind of fighting for your roster spot every single year in the NFL. I think Powell himself, as he came back on a like $2.5 million deal, probably not fighting for his roster spot as much, just because he did enough last year that he's got a little bit of leash. But like, you're sweating out cut down day kind of guy. That said, looking at the wide receiver group, he's probably a comfortable 5 right now under Naylor, after Jefferson, Addison, Brandon Powell, Naylor, and Sherfield. That's like probably your group. And if you want a 6th one, because we drafted someone or something like that, then we start getting a little bit of roster pressure. So we're getting to a point with this wide receiver room that it feels like a completed thought. The defensive line room, not yet a completed thought. And I've got some complaints about that, I guess. So let's characterize that next. Today's episode of Locked On Vikings is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Say goodbye to busted brackets, rip them up, throw them in the trash, because with FanDuel, you can bet on any individual game instead of trying to predict them all at once. Whether you are betting on a big upset or something more conservative, go ahead and get to America's #1 sportsbook. And if you are new, you can get $200 back in bonus bets if any $5 bet wins. Your first $5 bet win. So go sign up at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Lay down a $5 bet that you feel really good about, and it can be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be a spread or something with even-ish odds. It can be a 1 seed to beat a 16 seed. It can be that easy, and you can get $200 back in bonus bets. 40-1 odds on a $5 bet on a 1 seed to beat a 16 seed. How do you feel about that? Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Moving right along here with this episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast. Here's the deal, all right? This defensive line isn't done yet. It doesn't feel like it is ready to be done yet. And my concern is that that they are done with it. But this is not yet a completed thought. This, as an entire unit regarding, who is going to be inside and outside as whatever, between Jonathan Grenard and Andrew Van Ginkel, and then Harrison Phillips and Jonathan Bullard and Jaquelin Roy and Jerry Tillery, I guess, you've got enough like rotational guys. But then you have your depth guys in terms of Patrick Jones and Andre Carter, and then you have but that's it. Then you ran out of guys. That's it. So this is like just not a completed thought, because you only have 8 guys in the room. You usually roster 9. They've even rostered 10 before. And you'll bring in way more than that for actual camp. But Some of those camp bodies are comprised of like CFL randos and, 7th round picks and guys that you don't really expect to have an impact on the roster. So I'm thinking, do they have their starting line together? If the answer to that is yes, yikes. I don't know. I don't feel great about this at all, right? Okay, so you've got this Harrison Phillips, Jonathan Bullard thing. You've replaced Dean Lowry with Jerry Tillery. How do we feel about that? Do we feel like we got better there? I mean, look, Dean Lowry missed a bunch of games, so Jerry Tillery can play just as poorly, but play all the games, and you can still technically say that you got more out of him. I don't feel good about that, though, right? Like, that doesn't feel like you're able to, defend the run in the same way that you could. I like Jonathan Bullard, I do, and I think that him as a rotational guy, him in the Dean Lowry role of guy that comes off in base packages, that comes off in nickel, I like that for Jonathan Bullard. That was Dean Lowry last year, and Bullard actually played a little more in some of the forefronts. But that probably would be Tillery now, or Tillery would come in as Jonathan Bullard's replacement in those nickel fronts. And that would actually feel okay to me because he is a pass rush specialist, Jerry Tillery is. If you have your base package that's Phillips and Bullard and someone else, someone that can potentially, take on a double a little bit better. And that might be a draft pick, or somebody like Jaquelin Roy maybe taking the next step would be great. And if that's your kind of 3 defensive linemen and you've got your edge rushers outside of it, then, you go to the nickel, and as part of the nickel, you also bring off Jonathan Bullard and Jaquelin Roy, or whoever that guy is, and then bring Jerry Tillery out there and say, this is our 3rd and 10 package, then I can feel a little bit better about that. Or maybe that guy's Harrison Phillips or whatever, whoever your worst pass rusher is. And you replace them with Jerry Tillery for 3rd downs. That's great. My concern is that they're going to look at this and say, look at that. We've got a whole bunch of okay guys, and that's going to make for, and then we're going to like scheme our way out of it again. And they schemed their way out of not having a lot of talent at corner, which they haven't done anything about that either yet. They haven't changed that group at all. So Flores schemed his way out of it, but that had a shelf life. That was a short-term solution that was never going to survive a smart offensive coordinator figuring out what to do. And then other smart offensive coordinators figuring out how to get their team to emulate that. That was always going to be the case. And some injuries mounted and made it so that it was harder to make adjustments the way Flores wanted. And I'm sure Flores has all kinds of interesting little schematic quirks and stuff. Little wrinkles and solutions to those problems that he'll be ready to deploy. Sure. Right. But I don't think you can walk into the season saying, let's have a bunch of all right guys and then scheme around it, right? So unless they're way higher on Jerry Tillery than everybody else, which you kind of have to respect if they've got a reason to be. Again, I'll get into it and see if I can figure out what that reason is. Or they're way higher on Jonathan Bullard than everybody else, or on Andrew Van Ginkel than everybody else. They kind of got Jonathan Grenard, who is lesser Danielle Hunter, right? That's the role that he will have, and that you spent less on than you would have spent on Danielle Hunter. And then a whole bunch of players making generously, we can call it, role player money. That's not a complete thought yet. Defensive line is maybe the singular position where you most need a guy that makes things happen, a thing happener. That's what you need on D-line, right? That is a proactive position. Position like O-line, that's a reactive position where you're preventing something you're trying to prevent whatever the D-line guy is doing, right? Cornerback, preventative position. D-line is an active position where the onus is on you to go make a problem happen. So role players, and there is a place for the unselfish, I'll just do kind of my part of it to let someone else shine, but there's got to be someone there to shine. And ideally, there's more than one guy there to shine. Right now, there's Grenard, and that's the one guy. Because Harrison Phillips, great player, but he is very much an unselfish, role player type. He is not the focal point of a defense, and he's happy with that. He's proud of that role. And I don't think you can say that about any of these random Rotato guys. So they need more. Luckily, the well is not entirely dry quite yet. There are still some interesting-ish names out there. There's Jadeveon Clowney's taking a lot of interviews. I don't think the Vikings are in on him. He's 31, so that's a little bit tougher. I think the name that a lot of people are starting to pine for is Chase Young, also in the interview process, and the Vikings aren't in on it. Like, I don't think they're in on an edge rusher, but if you want to daydream for 2 more seconds, you can. Like, Derek Barnett is still out there. I still kind of like him. I kind of hope that they go somewhere else with like a defensive lineman, like somebody on the interior. Tier Tart is a name that gets thrown around a lot. He was in Minnesota for joint practices. You might remember a Bradbury lowlight he handed him. He had kind of a falling out in Tennessee, so you have to make sure that you don't have like a head case thing going on. But that's a question, not an answer, right? You just got to ask, and maybe you'll find an answer that you're satisfied with, and you're totally fine there. And even somebody like, I'm thinking like Mike Dana, right? He was on Kansas City playing on the interior in a rotational sense in that Super Bowl. Like, one more guy to rotate. Like, I feel like with rotational guys, 3 players can do the job of 2 players, and then you can start to feel okay of it. I can get there, but I do want like one more guy. I don't know. I like Derek Barnett, and I just think that he would be like a good value. But I feel like we're getting to a point here where D-line has to be such a priority in the draft that it like changes the way you negotiate for a quarterback. And the entire point of free agency is to make it so that that's not the case. I want one more exciting name. I want somebody here that I can really look at and say, you are going to be my game record today. And I do think that Grenard can be that guy. He can't always be that guy. I think there's certain kinds of offensive linemen that will counter him really well. So then you got nobody in those games. You need somebody else. This is not a complete room. And I am concerned that they're going to go get like some depth and nothing more. Hopefully I'm wrong there. But right now this is a work in progress, if you ask me. And if they roll a work in progress onto the field, we all get to be mad at them over it. I will talk to you next weekend, or after the weekend. Next week, we'll talk about whatever happens over the weekend. Still do YouTube shorts or whatever if I have to, but otherwise we will reconvene on Monday. I will see you all then. And as always, Skull.